Rutherford Crane didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Evangeline Wycliffe's study swung open hard enough to rattle the window glass, and he walked in like a man who had already decided the room belonged to him. 3 of his riders stood in the hallway behind him, hats on, boots muddy across her threshold. Crane himself dropped a folded document onto her desk, right on top of the ledger she'd been working in, and pressed 2 thick fingers against it, like he was pinning something that might try to escape. "Sign it today," he said. "Tomorrow I start pulling the water." Evangeline didn't move. She looked at his hand on her papers, then looked at his face and said nothing. "You think I'm bluffing." He smiled. It wasn't a pleasant thing. Ask the Hendersons what I do when I'm not bluffing. The Hendersons had sold their land in March. Nobody in Copper Ridge talked about why. If you've never heard a story about a woman who refused to break, subscribe to this channel right now, because this one will stay with you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Because what happens next in Copper Ridge, Montana, is something nobody in that valley saw coming, least of all the poor cowboy whose daughter started the whole thing. The morning Tansy Calder brought a stranger home, Bram Calder was elbow deep in a problem he'd been trying to solve since 6 o'clock. The problem was a fence post, or rather, what used to be a fence post before the ground heaved up during last week's freeze and snapped it clean at the base. The wood was rotten halfway through, which meant it hadn't been a good post to begin with, which meant whoever had put it in had either been careless or in too much of a hurry to care. Bram suspected it had been himself, about 4 years ago, when he'd been trying to replace 300 feet of north fence in 2 days, because the money for a hired hand had run out. He yanked the broken stub free, tossed it into the dirt, and crouched down to check how far the rot went. Far enough. He sat back on his heels and looked down the fence line. 6 other posts looked the same, leaning. Soft. The kind of thing you could ignore through summer if you were busy enough and desperate enough and just tired enough. He'd been all 3 for going on 2 years now. Behind him, across the bare yard, the house sat quiet. It always sat quiet when Tansy was at school. That was the thing about raising a child alone. You only noticed the silence when they weren't filling it. Bram stood, pressed a hand to the small of his back, where something had been pulling wrong since he'd spent 3 days roping strays in September, and reached for the new post he'd dragged out from behind the barn. It was a decent post. Straight-grained, dry all the way through, the kind of timber you couldn't find cheap anymore. He'd traded 2 days of labor to a sawmill operation outside of Billings for a dozen of them, and he was using them like a man spending his last dollar carefully, and with the constant low-grade dread that there wasn't another dollar behind this one. The bank had sent a letter in October. He hadn't thrown it away because he wasn't the kind of man who threw away problems. He kept it in the kitchen drawer, under the deed, and the 2 photographs, one of the ranch when he'd first bought it, and one of his wife, Clara, taken the summer before Tansy was born. He'd read the letter 4 times. He'd understood exactly what it said. He just hadn't figured out yet what he was going to do about it. He lifted the post, set the base into the hole he'd dug, and started tamping the earth around it. That was when he heard Tansy's voice coming up the lane. She was talking not to herself. She was talking not to herself, which she did sometimes when she was working something out, but in the bright, deliberate way she talked when she wanted someone to pay attention. He straightened and turned, shading his eyes. Tansy came around the bend in the lane at her usual pace, which was faster than most adults walked and twice as purposeful. Her coat was buttoned wrong, 3rd button through the 2nd hole, which she'd been doing for 2 weeks and refused to correct because she said it was faster in the morning. Her braids were half undone. She had her school bag over one shoulder, and she was talking steadily to the woman walking beside her. Bram went very still. He knew who that woman was. Evangeline Wycliffe had arrived in Copper Ridge in early September, 6 weeks after inheriting her late husband's cattle estate from his will, a document that had apparently surprised several people, including Wycliffe's 2 adult sons from his first marriage, who had promptly hired a lawyer in Helena. She'd come from Philadelphia, by way of Billings, with a modest amount of luggage and an immodest amount of calm for a pum, walking into a situation that most people expected to swallow her whole. Bram had seen her once, at a distance, outside the land office in town. He'd thought then, what he thought now, she carried herself like someone who had survived something, and was still deciding how to feel about having survived it. She was not what Copper Ridge had expected. He'd heard enough talk to know that much. He dropped the tamping rod. It hit the ground with a thud he didn't mean to make, but neither of them seemed to notice. They were still 20 yards out, Tansy pointing at something along the fence line and explaining it with the seriousness of a surveyor. Bram picked the rod back up because he needed something to do with his hands. They came through the gate. Tansy spotted him immediately and altered course without breaking her sentence. And that's the North Pasture, but Papa doesn't run cattle up there in winter because of the draws. They can get stuck. She arrived at his side, tilting her head back to look up at him. Papa, I brought someone home. She doesn't have anybody either. Bram looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Evangeline Wycliffe. The woman met his eyes without any of the social performance. He'd half expected no apologetic smile, no flutter of self-conscious embarrassment at being marched onto a stranger's property by an 8-year-old. She just looked back at him with the measured steadiness of someone waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be in the next 30 seconds. He was aware that his hands were dirty and that he'd been wearing the same shirt for 3 days. I'm sorry, he said, which was not what he'd meant to say first, but came out anyway. My daughter has certain she doesn't always. She was very kind, Evangeline said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected. Unhurried. I was sitting on the schoolhouse steps, waiting for Mr. Phipps to return my signed enrollment card, and your daughter sat down beside me and told me I looked like I needed a cup of something hot. Bram closed his eyes briefly. Tansy. You always say tea fixes most things, Tansy said, with the unassailable confidence of a child quoting a parent back at them. And she was sitting there a long time, Papa. Nobody else talked to her. There was a pause. Bram opened his eyes and looked at Evangeline Wycliffe again. She was watching Tansy, with an expression he recognized. Without wanting to, it was the look of someone who had not expected to be seen, and wasn't sure yet whether being seen was safe. He'd worn that expression himself after Clara died. We have tea, he said. It's not anything special. But if you'd like to come in, only if I'm not taking you from your work. The post'll keep. He looked at the fence and then back at her. It's kept this long. The kitchen was the best room in the house, which wasn't saying much but wasn't nothing either. Clara had put up the curtains yellow cotton, badly faded now, and there was a rag rug in front of the stove that Tansy refused to let him replace because she'd made it herself when she was 6. Loom-weaving strips of worn-out flannel shirts under her mother's supervision in the months before Clara got sick. Bram had let a great many things in the house go. He hadn't touched the rug. He put the kettle on while Tansy hung up her coat still crooked and began explaining to Evangeline the exact procedure for making decent range tea, which apparently required Tansy's ongoing supervision. You have to let it go longer than you think, Tansy said seriously. Papa always pulls it too early and then it tastes like nothing. I pull it when it's done, Bram said. It's not done. It's been 4 minutes. It needs 5. He looked at Evangeline. She was sitting at the table, her hands folded in front of her, watching the exchange with the careful interest of someone studying a foreign country's customs, not judgmentally, just paying attention. 5 minutes, he said, and moved the kettle back. Tansy looked satisfied. She pulled out the chair across from Evangeline and climbed into it, dropping her school bag at her feet. Do you know how to ride? She asked. I'm learning, Evangeline said. Tansy blinked. You inherited a cattle ranch and you're learning to ride? Tansy Bram said. That's a fair question, Evangeline said. She didn't seem offended. My husband managed the property. I managed other things. Now I'm managing everything, so yes, I'm learning to ride. I'm not very good yet. Papa could teach you, Tansy said. He's the best rider in the valley. Even Mr. Crane said so, and Mr. Crane doesn't like Papa. The name dropped into the kitchen like something thrown. Bram turned from the stove. Evangeline had gone still in a way that was different from her previous stillness. This was the stillness of someone keeping a reaction contained by force of will. You know Rutherford Crane, Bram said. It wasn't a question. He's visited my property 3 times since September, Evangeline said, even and careful. Each time to make an offer on the land. And each time you've said no. Each time I've said no. Bram poured the tea. He set a cup in front of her, one in front of Tansy weaker, more milk, and kept one for himself. He stood at the counter rather than sit, which was a habit he'd had for years, and Clara used to tease him about. Too restless to settle, she'd said. You'd eat your supper standing up if I let you. His men cut 3 sections of your east fence 2 weeks ago, Bram said. Evangeline looked at him. I didn't say anything in town because it wasn't my business, he said. And because saying things about Crane and Copper Ridge has a way of getting back to Crane before it gets anywhere useful. You saw them? I was up on the ridge checking my water situation. I saw 2 riders come off Crane's property onto yours, work through a section of fence, and ride back. Evangeline was quiet for a moment. Her hands were still around the cup, but her knuckles had gone pale. I found the cuts, she said. I thought it was weather damage. It wasn't. Tansy was looking between them with 8-year-old alertness, reading the room in the way children do when the adults stop performing calm and start having an actual conversation. She picked up her cup with both hands and said nothing, which for Tansy required visible effort. "Why are you telling me now?" Evangeline asked. It was a good question. He'd been asking himself the same thing for about 45 seconds. "Because you're sitting in my kitchen," he said. "And because Crane offered me money last month." That got her attention in a different way. "He offered you money to do what?" she asked. "Talk to you. Help convince you the land was more trouble than it was worth." He called it. Bram paused, turning the word over like something distasteful. "A neighborly favor." Evangeline looked at him for a long time. "And you're telling me this," she said slowly, "which means you said no." I said no. "Why?" Bram picked up his cup. "Because I don't do favors for men like Crane." Another silence. Outside, the wind moved along the eaves in that particular Montana, way not howling, just present, reminding you it was there and that it had opinions about the winter coming. "Your fence line on the north section," Evangeline said finally. "The posts along the draw, 3 of them are leaning badly. I noticed riding past 2 days ago." Bram looked at her. "I know," he said. "I have a good stock of cedar posts I haven't used yet. More than I'll need before spring." He shook his head. "I don't take charity. I know you don't." She lifted the cup, drank, set it down. "That's why I said cedar posts and not money. You could call it a trade if it makes you feel better about it." "A trade for what?" She looked across the table at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize, not amusement, not quite challenge either. Something in between. "For telling me about my fence," she said. He started to argue and then stopped himself. Because the truth was, he was tired, and the fence was a real problem, and cedar posts weren't cheap, and she was right that it wasn't the same as money, and also because the tea had turned out to be a reasonable temperature for once. 5 minutes, he said. "What?" "The tea. Tansy was right. 5 minutes is better." Evangeline looked at Tansy. Tansy pressed her lips together, very hard to keep from looking too pleased about it. "It usually is," Evangeline said. She came back the following Thursday. Not for tea, she had a question about the water table in the northwest section of her property, and someone in town had mentioned that Bram Calder had found water on what 3 other ranchers had called dead ground. She arrived while he was still in the barn, rode her horse in through the open door without ceremony, dismounted with the slightly too careful movement of someone still working out their relationship with the animal, and asked her question. He answered it. Then he asked one back about her land map, which he'd seen once at the county office and which had 2 notations on it he'd been curious about for a while. She answered that. They stood in the barn aisle with their respective horses, looking on with animal disinterest, and talked for 40 minutes about water, ground, and the particular way the valley floor sloped in a direction most people didn't account for in their drainage systems. When she left, Bram watched her ride out and thought about the way she'd described her husband's cattle records, 3 years of systematic logging, every head tracked, every sale documented, the kind of operation that ran on paper as much as on pasture. Her husband had built it. Evangeline had read every line of every ledger after his death and understood all of it. He thought about that for a while. Then he went back to the fence. The talk started in November, quiet the way. Valley talk usually started a comment here, a significant look there. The kind of social weather you felt in your skin before you heard it with your ears. Marta Hensley at the dry goods told Bram that people were noticing Evangeline Wycliffe's horse tied at his property twice in 1 week. He said he'd noticed that too, and went back to looking at the flour prices. Ed Pruitt at the feed barn asked with elaborate casualness whether Bram had gotten friendly with the new widow. Bram said he'd answered some questions about water tables and left. The reverend, who wasn't exactly Bram's reverend, since Bram's relationship with organized faith had been complicated, since Clara's death stopped him on the street, to comment that it was good that Mrs. Wycliffe was finding her footing in the community. Bram agreed that it was, and kept walking. None of it would have bothered him if he hadn't started noticing, underneath all the talk, something darker. The way some conversations stopped when Evangeline walked into a room. The way credit had apparently become difficult at several supply operations she'd been using. The way 2 of her 3 hired hands had quit inside of 2 weeks, both citing vague reasons that sounded rehearsed. He'd asked around carefully the way you asked when you couldn't afford to be seen asking, and what he'd put together wasn't pretty. Crane had been busy, not with anything you could point at in a courtroom. Just pressure. The kind of pressure that left no fingerprints, but worked through every soft joint in a person's circumstances until something gave. The night Bram understood the full shape of it, he stood in the kitchen for a long time after Tansy was asleep, looking at the bank letter in the drawer without opening it. Then he put the drawer back and went to bed, and lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a woman sitting alone in a house 3 miles away. Surrounded by cattle she was learning to manage, and a mountain of paper she already understood, and an enemy who had decided that her refusal to be beaten was something he needed to fix. He thought about it for a long time. He didn't come to any decisions that night, but the thinking itself felt like something. Crane came to see him in the 2nd week of November, this time without riders, which was almost more unsettling. He rode up the lane on a horse that cost more than Bram's barn, dismounted with the ease of a man who had never had to worry about what happened if his horse went lame, and stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the ranch with the expression of a man calculating something he'd already calculated before and arrived at the same number. Calder, Bram was on the porch. He didn't come down. Crane. Cold coming in early this year. Crane squinted at the sky. The sky was in fact doing something gray and noncommittal. Man needs to have his situation secure before real winter hits. Man does, Bram agreed. I heard you've been spending time with the Wycliffe woman. I heard that too. Crane looked at him. There was no pretense of warmth in it. Crane had a face built for transaction angular, dry, useful only for the expression of calculated interest. She's going to lose that property, he said. You understand that, don't you? A woman like that, alone, no real ranching experience. Montana winters have killed operations run by men who knew what they were doing. She's going to hit the wall by spring, and when she does, I'll be there to buy what's left. You seem very confident, Bram said. I am very confident. A pause. I'm also generous to the people who help things move in the right direction. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He held it out. That's a good offer, Calder. A real good offer. For a man in your situation. Bram looked at the envelope. He thought about the bank letter in the kitchen drawer. He thought about 14 years of work on ground that had fought him for most of it. He thought about the rotten fence post snapping in his hands. He thought about Tansy's rag rug, and Clara's yellow curtains going pale in the window, and the particular sound the house made when it was just the 2 of them inside it. No, he said. Crane didn't move. You haven't heard the number. Doesn't matter. Everything matters when the bank comes calling. Bram came down the porch steps. He stopped close enough that he didn't have to raise his voice. I know what you're doing to her, he said. The credit, the hands quitting, the fence. Crane's expression didn't change. It didn't need to. That's a serious accusation, Crane said. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you I know. Bram held the man's gaze. And I'm telling you that I'm not going to make it easier for you. Not for that money. Not for twice that money, the moment held. Then Crane took the envelope back and put it in his coat. He looked at Bram with something that wasn't quite anger. It was colder than anger, more deliberate. You're going to regret this, he said, without heat. Like a man noting a fact. Probably, Bram said. I've regretted most of the smart decisions I've ever made. Turns out I can live with it. Crane mounted his horse and rode down the lane. Bram stood watching him go until the sound of hooves on the frozen ground faded out. Then he went back inside to fix supper and didn't think too much about what came next, because thinking too much about what came next was a luxury he'd never been able to afford. The cattle started disappearing 4 days later. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, even for Crane. 3 head from the south draw, gone overnight, no sign of a break in the fence. 2 more from the east pasture, the section closest to Crane's property line. Then another 2, and Bram found the ground trampled near the fence in a pattern he recognized. Not animal movement, not drift. Something deliberate. He rode the fence lines twice a day after that. He didn't sleep well. Tansy noticed, because Tansy noticed everything. You're counting the cattle again, she said one morning, watching him from the barn door. Always count the cattle. You're counting them different, she said. Like the number's wrong, and you're hoping it'll change. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, sharp as a new nail. "We're going to be fine," he said. She considered this. "Papa, I'm 8, not 4. He almost smiled. "You're right. I'm worried. The numbers are off. I'm trying to figure out why." She nodded like this was acceptable information. "Is it Mr. Crane?" He looked at her sharply. "Where'd you hear about Crane?" "Town. People talk and they forget I'm small enough to be invisible." She shrugged. "He's mean to everybody, not just us. Johnny Pruitt says his dad says Crane owns half the county already and wants the other half." Bram crouched down to her level. "Listen to me," he said. "You don't talk about Crane at school. You don't say anything to anybody about what's happening here. Not because we have anything to hide. Because it's just safer right now. Understand?" She looked at him with Clara's eyes, serious, clear, taking in more than she gave back. "Okay," she said. "But Papa?" "Yeah, Mrs. Wycliffe is having the same problem." He went still. "What?" "I heard it from Lucy Marsh, whose dad works the North Road. He said he saw 3 of Mrs. Wycliffe's cattle in a different pasture than they should have been, and the fence between her property and Mr. Crane's was open on one side." Bram stood. "When was this?" 2 days ago. Tansy picked up her school bag. "I didn't say anything because you said, 'Don't talk about Crane,' but I thought you should know." She pulled her coat on still crooked, still wrong button and looked up at him. "She's nice, Papa. I don't want bad things to happen to her." He watched her walk down the lane toward the road. The morning was iron gray and cold. From the south pasture he could hear his remaining cattle, fewer than there should be. On the ridge, the first real snow clouds of the season were moving in from the northwest, not today, not yet, but within the week. He stood in the barn door and looked at the sky for a long time. Then he saddled his horse and rode toward Evangeline Wycliffe's land. She was at the barn when he arrived, working through a ledger propped on the top rail of the stall door, cross-referencing something against a handwritten tally she'd apparently done herself. Her ranch hand, just the one left now, a steady older man named Potts, who'd been on the property since her husband's time, was pitching hay nearby with the careful economy of movement that came from decades of the same work. She heard Bram's horse and turned. "You look like you've got bad news," she said. "Some of it's bad. Some of it's just information." He dismounted, let his horse stand loose it would. He'd trained it to and came to the rail. "How many head have you lost in the last 10 days? Her jaw tightened. 11. That I can confirm. "There may be more from the south sections Potts is checking today. I've lost 7. She put the ledger down flat on the rail. "Your property is 3 miles from mine." "I know. Crane's operation is between us." She looked at him with the contained anger of someone who'd been containing it for weeks. "This isn't coincidence. No, he's taking from both sides." She said it quietly, working it out. "Hitting us so neither of us has the standing to make a credible complaint, because neither of us can prove our specific cattle are on his land. That's my read." She looked at the ledger in her hand, then back at him. "What do you propose?" He hadn't expected her to ask that. He'd expected to have to work toward it more carefully, expect more resistance, more of the stubborn self-sufficiency he'd recognized in her, because he had it himself. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I came here to see what you knew before I started making plans." Something shifted in her expression, a slight relaxing of something that had been held tight. "That's a reasonable answer," she said. "I have them sometimes." She looked at Potts, then back at Bram. "Come inside. I'll make coffee. It'll be better than your tea, because I pull it at the right time, and I can show you the map of where the losses are tracking." He followed her in. The house was neat in a different way than his, not sparse like his, which was the neatness of someone who didn't have enough things to clutter a room, but the deliberate order of someone who had organized their life around being able to find what they needed when they needed it. Maps on the wall, filed papers, a weather log on the desk by the window, written in a careful hand with dates and notations. She'd been paying attention to everything. The coffee, as promised, was better than his tea. They sat at her table with the property map between them, and Bram looked at the pattern of losses while she narrated it, which pastures, which fence lines, which gaps. He looked at Crane's property boundary. He looked at the ridge lines and the draws and the trail system he knew from years of riding these hills before Crane had bought out the fielding operation and consolidated it into the giant that sat between their two. Ranches like something planted there deliberately. The clouds outside had moved in while they talked. The window was dimming. Evangeline looked up at the sky. "That storm's coming faster than the almanac predicted," she said. Bram looked too. It was coming faster than he'd predicted, and he'd been watching mountains his whole life. "How many hands do you have on property right now?" he asked. "Potts and one other Jenkins. He's reliable but young," Bram thought. He had himself in one hand, a man named Cord who'd worked his ranch for 3 years and was worth 2 of most others. "We should move your southern herd before that hits," he said. "And I want to ride the fence line on your north property today, before dark." She was already standing. "I'll get my coat." He looked at her. "You don't have to. It's my fence, Calder." She pulled on her coat decisively, without any of the tentative performance of a woman waiting to be told what to do. "Let's go." Outside, the snow clouds sat on the ridge like something that had decided to stay. Bram mounted. Evangeline mounted beside him, still not perfectly, still that slight hesitation at the top before she settled, but straighter than she'd been a month ago. They rode north, and by the time they reached the fence line, both of them understood that the storm bearing down from the mountains was going to make the next 12 hours the most important of the season. Neither of them knew yet how much more important than that. The fence line on Evangeline's north section was worse than either of them had expected. Bram dropped out of the saddle at the third post and crouched down without saying anything, pressing his fingers into the ground around the base. The earth was disturbed not by weather, not by frost heave, but by something deliberate. Someone had dug down around the post's base, loosened the packed soil, and tamped it back loosely enough that it looked untouched from a distance. The post would hold through a calm day. It would go down in a hard wind. He moved to the next post. Same thing. Evangeline rode up beside him and looked down at what he was looking at. "How many?" she asked. "Don't know yet." He stood and remounted. "Let's finish the line." They rode it in silence mostly, stopping every few hundred feet. By the time they reached the northwest corner where her property butted up against the ridge timber, they'd found 11 compromised posts in a row. Not all of them, whoever had done it, was smart enough to leave solid posts between the weakened ones, so the pattern wasn't obvious from a casual ride-through. You had to check each one. You had to know what you were looking for. "He's been planning this for weeks," Evangeline said. She wasn't asking. Her voice was level in the way. Voices got level when the alternative was something less controlled, at least. Bram looked up at the clouds. They were down off the ridge now, moving across the upper pasture like something being pushed. When this storm hits hard, that whole section goes down. Cattle drift north through the gaps. In blizzard conditions, you can't track where they go. And in the morning, he claims they wandered onto his property. And in the morning, you've lost 100 head to bad weather. And everybody knows a woman running a ranch alone isn't prepared for a Montana winter. Bram looked at her. "It's a clean move." Evangeline looked back at the fence line. Her horse shifted under her, and she steadied it without thinking about it, which was different from how she'd ridden a month ago. "I have materials in the barn," she said. "New posts, wire, hardware. It's 3 hours to dark, and that storm is moving fast." "I know it's moving fast." She turned her horse. "Are you going to help me or not?" He turned his too. "Potts and Jenkins," he said. "We'll need all 4 of us. I'll ride ahead and get them started loading." She went at a canter before he finished the sentence. He watched her go for about 2 seconds, then pressed his heels in and followed. They worked the fence for 2.5 hours in failing light, with the temperature dropping steadily and the wind picking up from the northwest in the way that meant business. Bram drove posts. Cord his hand, who he'd sent for after the first hour when it became clear the job was bigger than 4 people stretched wire, while Potts hammered staples with the grim efficiency of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. Jenkins, Evangeline's younger hand, kept the supply moving between the wagon and the work site without being told to. Evangeline worked alongside them, not directing, working. She'd changed into heavier gloves back at the barn, and she was on the line right next to Cord, holding the wire taut while he attached it. And when Bram glanced at her hands 20 minutes in, he could see the wire had already cut through one glove and drawn blood at the base of her thumb. "Your hand," he said. She looked at it. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You're bleeding." "I'll bleed later." "Is this post set?" He tested it. "Solid, yes. Next one." He moved to the next post. So did she. They didn't talk much after that. The wind was loud enough to make conversation expensive anyway, and there was too much work for words to do much good. The snow started coming in, not heavy yet, just the advance scouts, fine and stinging around the time they finished the 7th post. By the 9th, Bram could feel it accumulating on his shoulders. By the 11th, the light was almost entirely gone. Last one, he said, and drove it. He set the wire himself, working by feel as much as sight, cord holding a lantern that the wind kept making useless. He got it attached. He tested it again. Solid. He straightened up. For a moment, none of them moved. Just 5 people standing in a repaired fence line in the dark, with snow in their hair, and the wind telling them things they already knew. That's it, Potts said. He didn't say it like a triumph, just like a fact. That's it, Bram agreed. Evangeline said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the fence line, what she could see of it in the lantern light. Then she said, "Thank you, all of you." She said it to all of them, but she was looking at Bram when she said it. He nodded. It was all he had. They rode back to the barn. Potts and Jenkins took the wagon. Cord took the horse he'd come on and headed back toward Bram's property to check the herd before full dark, which left Bram and Evangeline standing in her barn while the storm announced itself properly. For the first time, the wind hitting the outside wall with a sound like a flat hand slapping wood. "Come inside," she said. "I'll clean that cut properly, and you'll eat something before you ride back." He started to argue. Calder. Her voice was tired in a way that cut through the argument before it started. "It's dark. It's snowing. Eat something." He put his horse in the spare stall and followed her inside. The kitchen was warm in the way kitchens were warm when someone had thought about it in advance. Banked fire. Kettle already at temperature, the kind of organized warmth that didn't happen by accident. She'd been managing this house alone for months, and it showed in the details, the way everything had a place, the extra lamp by the door for late arrivals, the firewood stacked inside rather than on the porch, because she'd learned that lesson early in her first Montana autumn. She cleaned her hand at the basin, wrapped it quickly, and put a plate of cold food on the table: bread, cured meat, some kind of pickled vegetable he didn't recognize. "Sit," she said. He sat. She sat across from him and poured coffee without asking whether he wanted it, which he appreciated. They ate. Outside, the storm was making itself at home. The window in the kitchen went from gray to solid dark while they sat there. "He'll know we fixed the fence," Evangeline said after a while. "He'll know," Bram agreed. "So he'll try something else. He'll try something else." She wrapped both hands around her cup, the injured one, carefully, just the fingertips, and looked across the table at him. "What I can't figure out," she said slowly, "is why he wants this particular property so badly. He already owns enough land to run twice the cattle he has." Bram chewed thought. "Water," he said. "I have the same water sources as every ranch in the valley." "You have the Alderman Spring." He watched her face. "You know about the Alderman Spring?" "My husband's papers mention it. A natural spring in the northwest section. It's on the map." "It doesn't just feed your northwest section," Bram said. "Follow the underground geology, and it ties into the main aquifer that runs under half this valley. Right now it doesn't matter much because we've had decent water years. But we're heading into a dry cycle. Anyone who's been paying attention to the last 3 summers can see it. In 10 years, maybe less, whoever controls the Alderman Spring controls the water for everything south of the ridge." Evangeline was very still. "He told me the land was worth less than his offer," she said. "He told you what he needed you to believe." She set down her cup, picked it back up, put it down again in a slightly different spot, like she was rearranging something in her head, and the cup was a piece of it. "My husband knew," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. I don't know what your husband knew, but the spring is on the county survey. Anyone who looked at it carefully would understand what it means." She looked at the window, solid dark now, snow audible against the glass. "My husband's sons are contesting the will," she said. "I haven't told many people the details. But the grounds they're using, the argument they're making, is that their father was not in sound mind when he changed it." Bram looked at her. "He changed it to leave the property to you," he said. "He changed it 18 months before he died. He was completely sound. I have 3 physicians who will say so." A pause. "But litigation is expensive and slow. And while it goes on, I'm managing a property I'm still learning, fighting a neighbor who is systematically making that management harder, and trying not to give anyone grounds to say a woman alone can't hold this together." She said it without self-pity, the way you stated the conditions of a problem you were working on. Bram was quiet for a moment. "Your husband's sons," he said. "Are they connected to Crane?" The question hung between them. Evangeline's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. "I don't know," she said carefully. "I haven't been able to find out. Might be worth finding out." "It might be." She looked at him directly. You know more about this valley and the people in it than I do. You've been here how long? 14 years. And Crane? He bought the Fielding property 9 years ago. Built it up fast. Too fast, honestly, for a man starting clean. But nobody asked too many questions because he brought money in, and money was what the county needed. Bram turned his coffee cup in his hands. He's not stupid. He doesn't break laws where people can see him break them. He applies pressure in ways that look like weather, just bad luck, just hard circumstances. Until someone starts documenting the pattern, Evangeline said. He looked at her. You've been documenting. Every fence cut, every supply refusal, every name of every hand who quit, and what they said when they left. She stood, went to the desk near the window, and came back with a leather-covered journal. She put it on the table between them. I've been doing it since October. He picked it up, opened it. The entries were dated, specific, written in the same careful hand as the weather log names, dates, exact descriptions of what had been found or said or refused. This was not a woman who had stumbled into a problem and was hoping it would resolve itself. You were already building a case, he said. I was already building a case. She sat back down. I just didn't have a witness to the fence cutting until tonight. He looked at her across the journal. I saw them in October, he said. I can put that in writing. That would be useful. She held his gaze. Why are you willing to do this? Genuinely. You've already turned down his money. You've got your own problems, the bank, the cattle losses. You don't owe me anything. It was the same question she'd asked in a different form back at his kitchen table weeks ago, and he still didn't have a clean answer for it. He thought about what he'd said then, that he didn't do favors for men like Crane, and that was true, but it wasn't complete. Because what he's doing is wrong, he said. And I've spent 14 years trying to mind my own business and keep my head down and not get into fights that weren't mine. And I've watched him push 3 families off land they'd worked for a generation, and I told myself it wasn't my problem. He set the journal down. Tansy asked me once why we didn't help the Hendersons when they were selling. I told her it wasn't our place. She was 6. She looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language she didn't understand. He was quiet a beat. She was right not to understand it. Evangeline was watching him with that careful, complete attention she gave things. She's a remarkable child, she said. She's too smart for my own good, he said. Most days. The storm hit the house hard enough to rattle something in the eaves. Both of them looked up, then back at each other. You're not writing back in this, she said. I've written in worse. I'm sure you have. You're still not doing it tonight. She stood, and there was no negotiating in the way she stood, just a decision already made. There's a room upstairs. It's cold, but there are blankets. I'll get the fire going in there. I don't want to put you to any trouble. It's no trouble. It would be trouble if you rode out in that, and your horse put a foot wrong in the dark, and you didn't make it back. And then Tansy had no one. That would be considerable trouble. She said it practically, not unkindly. So you'll stay. He stayed. He lay in the cold upstairs room, listening to the storm work on the house and the valley and the fence they'd just repaired, and thought about what Evangeline had said about her husband's sons. About the will. About Crane. In the morning, when the storm had quieted to a steady snowfall, he helped Potts dig out the barn access and check the herd before riding back. Evangeline stood in the yard in the snow, watching her cattle move in the east pasture, counting them the way ranchers counted, not with a number in mind, but looking for the shape of the group to feel right. They're all there, she said. Your fence held, he said. She looked at him sideways. Our fence held. He got on his horse. I'll write up what I saw in October, he said, dated, specific. Who, what, where. I'll add it to the journal. He started to write out and then stopped. Your husband's sons, he said. When is the next court date in Helena? She looked up at him. February. Why? Because I know a man in Billings who used to work county survey. He's retired now, but he still has contacts at the land office. If there's a connection between Crane and the sons, it'll show somewhere in the property filings. Crane's bought enough land in this territory that there'll be a paper trail. Evangeline was quiet for a moment. You'd ask him to look? I'd ask him to look. She stood in the snow with her arms crossed against the cold and looked at him with the expression he was starting to recognize, the one that wasn't quite surprise, but was its close neighbor. All right, she said. He rode home. The valley looked different under snow. Harder and simpler, the way cold simplified things, stripped them down to what mattered. His own herd was intact. Cord had checked twice during the storm, worried enough to stay through the night, which Bram had known he would. The cattle looked rough but sound. The fence he'd been working on held. The house was cold when he came in, which meant the fire had gone low in the night, and he got it back up and stood in the kitchen, warming his hands and listening to the quiet. He pulled the bank letter out of the drawer and read it again. The numbers hadn't changed since October. The deadline was February, same month as Evangeline's court date in Helena, which struck him as either meaningful or just the universe being blunt about things. He put the letter back. Tansy was at school. He could hear nothing but wind and the occasional complaint of the eaves settling under snow load, and the house felt large and specifically empty in the way it did when he let himself notice it. He thought about the upstairs room at Evangeline's property cold. Yes, but with blankets that smelled like cedar, and a house underneath that felt like someone was actually running it. He thought about how strange it was to lie awake in someone else's house and have it feel less lonely than lying awake in your own. He stopped thinking about that fairly quickly. He had work to do. The survey contact in Billings was a man named Aldous Trent, 63 years old, with a bad hip and a meticulous memory for property lines and ownership transfers going back 30 years. Bram rode into Billings on the first clear day after the storm, which was also the first clear day he could spare from the ranch, and found Trent at home in the way retired men were at home, comfortable, slightly bored, and immediately interested when Bram explained what he was looking for. Crane, Trent said, and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I've looked at his filings before. Not because anyone asked me to, just because they were interesting. Interesting how? Trent got up and went to a filing cabinet in the corner of his parlor, moving with the deliberate economy of a man who'd learned to work around a bad hip. He pulled a folder and brought it back. He uses 3 different holding companies, Trent said, sitting back down and opening the folder, all registered in the territory. The names don't connect to him directly. You'd need to trace the ownership back through the county articles of incorporation. He found a page and turned it toward Bram. This one here, Meridian Grazing Company, filed in 1884. Silent partners listed as 2 individuals from Philadelphia. Bram looked at the names. He looked at them for a moment. Do you have Wycliffe's will contest on file somewhere? He asked. I have access to Helena's court filings. Trent's eyes were sharper than his bad hip suggested. You think the sons are named in Meridian Grazing? I think it's possible. Trent was quiet for a moment, turning it over. If Wycliffe's sons are silent partners in a Crane holding company, and if that company stands to benefit from acquiring the Wycliffe estate, then a court in Helena might be very interested in the motivation behind a will contest. He paused. That's not a sure case. But it's a shape of a case. That's enough, Bram said. I just need the shape of it. He rode back with copies of the filings in his coat. He didn't go straight home. He rode to Evangeline's. She was in her study when he arrived, Potts letting him in with the neutral efficiency of a man who had stopped being surprised by Bram Calder's horse in the yard. She looked up from the ledger she was working in and read his expression before he said a word. You found something, she said. He sat down across from her and put the copies on the desk. She read them carefully, the way she read everything completely, without rushing, going back twice on the passages that mattered. When she finished, she set the papers down and sat very still for a moment. They're partners, she said. Silent partners. In a company Crane controls. A company that would benefit directly from acquiring your property. She looked at the window. Snow was still coming down outside, lighter now, the trailing edge of the storm. They're contesting my right to the land, she said quietly, while they're already contracted to profit from its sale. That's what those papers suggest. She looked back at him. Her expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it, now that he hadn't seen from her before, not fear, not defeat. Something closer to the cold focus of someone who has been patient a long time and has just found the place where patience ends. My attorney in Helena needs to see these, she said. He does. I'll write to him today. She put her hand on the papers. Bram. It was the first time she'd used his name without the full surname. It seemed to register for both of them. At the same moment, neither of them made anything of it, but neither of them pretended they hadn't noticed. These papers, she said. This changes the shape of everything. Might change it, he said. Courts are slow. Evidence has to be argued. Crane has resources, I know. She didn't say it dismissively. She said it like someone accounting for variables. But it changes it. He nodded. She looked at the ledger still open on the desk, then at the papers in her hand, then back at him with an expression That was one of the more complicated things he'd seen on a person's face in recent memory. "You rode to Billings and back in this weather," she said, "to bring me this." Road was clear enough. "That's not what I said." He looked at the window. "My daughter likes you," he said. "She'd be upset if Crane ran you out of the valley." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, the kind of silence that knew it was covering something and wasn't doing a perfect job. "Of course," Evangeline said after a moment. "Tansy." "Yes." "Right." She straightened the papers. "Well, tell Tansy I'm grateful. I'll tell her." He stood up. She stood up. They were briefly both standing on the same side of the desk because she'd moved to hand him back one of the copies he needed to keep, and the study wasn't large. She handed him the paper. He took it. "Be careful writing back," she said. "I will. The draws on your south section fill with drift in a storm. You know that. I know that. I've known that for 14 years. I'm aware you've known it for 14 years. She held his gaze for a beat. "I'm saying it anyway." He put the paper in his coat and left. Riding home in the last gray light of the afternoon, the snow packed under his horse's feet and the ridge dark against the sky, he thought about the particular quality of that silence in her study. He thought about it the way you thought about a loose thread not pulling it, just aware of it. He had enough problems without pulling threads. He got home before full dark, checked the cattle, got the fire going, started supper. Tansy came in from school, with her coat still buttoned wrong, and her braids intact for once, which probably meant she'd been concentrating hard on something all day, and hadn't moved around enough to undo them. "How was Mrs. Wycliffe?" she asked, dropping her bag. He looked at his daughter. "How did you know I went to see Mrs. Wycliffe?" "You have that look." "What look?" Tansy sat down at the table. "The one where you've been thinking hard about something, and it went better than you expected, but you don't want to say so." She opened her school bag and pulled out a reader. "She's okay?" "She's okay." "Good." She opened the reader. "Papa?" "Yeah. Mr. Crane's men were on the road past school today. 3 of them. They were watching who went where." Bram turned from the stove. Tansy was looking at her reader with the careful, studied nonchalance of a child, reporting something she knew was important and was working to report without alarming anyone. "Did they speak to you?" he asked. "No, they just watched." She turned a page she clearly hadn't read. It felt like they were counting something. He turned back to the stove. The fire needed managing. The supper needed watching. Outside, the last light was going, and the snow was settling hard on the valley, and somewhere 3 miles away, Evangeline Wycliffe was sitting in her study writing a letter to a lawyer in Helena that might change everything, or might change nothing, depending on how a court decided to read a set of papers on a cold February morning. And Rutherford Crane's men were on the road, counting things. Bram stirred the pot and listened to the wind and the quiet breath of his daughter turning pages in the other room, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrived sometimes in the middle of ordinary moments, that whatever came next was going to come hard and fast, and probably before either of them was ready for it. The letter to Helena went out on a Tuesday. By Friday, Crane knew about it. Bram didn't know whether someone at the post office had talked, or whether Crane had a contact at the courier relay in Billings who watched what went where and to whom. In a valley this size, information moved the way water moved, through every crack available, finding the low ground without being asked. What he knew was that on Friday afternoon, Jenkins Evangeline's younger hand rode up to Bram's property with the particular tight expression of someone carrying news they didn't want to carry. Bram was splitting wood when he arrived. He set them all down. "She sent you?" he asked. "She doesn't know I'm here." Jenkins dismounted, turned his hat in his hands. He was maybe 22, raw-boned, with the look of a young man learning faster than he wanted to that the world wasn't organized the way he'd thought. "Crane's foreman came to the ranch this morning." "Vickers, you know him?" "I know him. He told Mrs. Wycliffe that 2 of her south pasture wells are on disputed ground. Said Crane's filed a boundary claim with the county surveyor. Said until the claim's resolved, she can't draw from those wells without risking a trespass citation." Jenkins looked at his hat. "Mr. Calder, those wells water 1/3 of her herd. In this cold, if she can't, I know what it means." Bram picked up his coat from the fence post. "Is Vickers still on her property?" "He left. But he said Crane expects an answer by Monday, about the wells and about the sale." Monday was 3 days away. Bram pulled his coat on. "Go back. Don't tell her you came here. Just go back and do your work." Jenkins looked uncertain. "What are you going to do?" "Talk to someone." He was already heading for the barn. "Go. The someone was Ed Marsh, who ran a small freight operation on the South Road, and who had, over 20 years of hauling between Copper Ridge and Billings, developed the kind of comprehensive knowledge of the valley's legal and financial arrangements that came from driving past everything and listening to everyone. Ed wasn't a gossip, he was something more useful than a gossip. He was a man who remembered things accurately and knew how to distinguish between what people said and what was actually true. Bram found him at the freight barn, going over a manifest. Boundary claim, Ed said when Bram explained it. He didn't look up from the manifest. Filed Tuesday. I heard about it Wednesday from a man who works the county office. He turned a page. It's thin, Bram. The survey markers on that property haven't moved in 20 years. Crane knows it won't hold. He just needs it to hold long enough. Long enough for what? Long enough for her cattle to suffer through 2 weeks without reliable water in January weather, and for the valley to see it happen. Ed put the manifest down. It's not about the wells. It's about the picture. Woman can't manage her property, stock's in trouble, county's watching. That's when you make the offer and people nod along. Because they've already decided she was going to fail. Bram stood in the freight barn, with the smell of hay and cold iron around him, thinking about what Ed had just said. The boundary claim can be contested, he said. It can. Takes time. How much time? Filed properly with a counter-survey. 3 weeks minimum. Probably 4. Ed picked up his manifest again. She doesn't have 4 weeks. No, Bram agreed, she doesn't. He rode home the long way, along the ridge road that let him see both properties from above his own, to the south smaller. The barn and house, and the thin thread of smoke from the chimney visible even at this distance, and Evangeline's to the north, larger, the herd moving in the east pasture, the house sitting solid and well-kept in the snow. Between them, Crane's operation sprawled across the middle of the valley, like something that had decided it owned the view. He thought about the Alderman Spring. He thought about water and time, and what men like Crane understood about both. He went home. He made supper. He waited for Tansy to fall asleep, then sat at the kitchen table with the deed to his property and the bank letter and the copies of Trent's filings, laying them out in front of him like a hand of cards he hadn't asked to be dealt. The deed gave him grazing rights on the South Ridge rights he hadn't fully exercised in 2 years, because he hadn't had the cattle to run up there. The rights didn't expire. They were his, clear in the document, filed with the county in 1875. He looked at the ridge on his hand-drawn property map. He looked at where his South Ridge rights touched the northeast corner of Evangeline's property. He looked at where Crane's claimed boundary line sat, according to the copy of the filing Ed had described. He sat there for a while. Then he went to bed, because what he just understood was the kind of thing you slept on before you said out loud. He slept badly. He was up before 4, in the barn by 4:30, which was when Tansy found him at 5:15, because Tansy had her mother's instinct for knowing when something was happening and her father's inability to stay in bed once he'd decided on a course of action. She stood in the barn door in her coat and boots over her nightgown, her hair loose. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Go back inside. It's cold." "What are you doing, Papa?" He looked at his daughter. "I'm thinking." "You think in the barn?" "Sometimes." She came in and sat on a hay bale and pulled her coat tighter. The horses moved in their stalls with the slow calm of animals, confident that someone was managing things. "It's about Mrs. Wycliffe," she said. "Most things are, lately." Tansy considered this with the seriousness she gave most things. "Are you going to fix it?" "I'm going to try." "You always say trying's not the same as doing." "I know what I say." He looked at her. "Go inside, Tansy. I'll be in for breakfast in an hour." She didn't move for a moment, looking at him with Clara's eyes in the barn lamplight. "She's not going to ask for help," Tansy said, "even if she needs it. She's like you." He opened his mouth to respond and closed it again, because he didn't have a good argument against that. "Go inside," he said. She went. He rode to Evangeline's after breakfast, and this time he didn't beat around it. He sat at her kitchen table and told her what Ed Marsh had told him, and what he'd worked out in the barn at 4 in the morning, and what he thought needed to happen next. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that he'd come to rely on without meaning to the way she actually listened, rather than waiting for a pause to insert what she'd already decided. When he finished, she said, "You'd put your ridge grazing rights on record as adjacent to my contested boundary. If your attorney in Helena files a counter-survey and cites my existing rights as the reference point, Crane's claim falls apart." My rights predate his by 11 years. He can't file a boundary that overwrites a prior grazing right without going through territorial court. That process still takes time, 3 weeks instead of 4. And it changes what he can do with the wells. In the meantime, he can't enforce a trespass citation on contested ground that references an active prior right. Your cattle drink. She was quiet. You'd be putting your name into a legal dispute with Crane, she said. My name's been in a dispute with Crane since November. Might as well make it official. She looked at her hands on the table. The cut from the wire had healed to a thin pink line across the base of her thumb. He'll come at your property, she said. He already has the cattle losses. But this will make it direct. I know. Your bank deadline is February. I know that too. She looked up at him, then why? He thought about what he'd said to her weeks ago about Tansy's face when he'd explained why they hadn't helped the Hendersons. About minding his own business for 14 years while Crane did what Crane did. Because it's the right move, he said. Legally and just. It's the right move. She held his gaze for a long moment. All right, she said. I'll write to my attorney today. Can you have the grazing rights documentation to me by tomorrow? I'll have it to you this afternoon. Then we'd better get the letter drafted. She stood and went to the desk. They spent an hour at her desk, Bram reading out the relevant sections of his deed while she wrote, her attorney's previous correspondence open beside her for reference. She knew how to write a legal communication precise, referencing the correct terminology, nothing vague or emotional. He found himself reading the same passage twice at one point, not because he'd lost his place, but because he was watching her work and hadn't been paying attention to the words. He looked back at the deed. This section here, he said. Subsection 3. Read that to your attorney verbatim. She wrote it down verbatim. When it was done, she sealed the envelope and handed it to him. Will you take it to the post yourself? She asked. Today on my way back. She walked him to the door. Outside, the sky was doing the flat white thing that sometimes preceded more snow, and sometimes just hung there threatening for days without following through. He got his horse from the rail and mounted. The letter reaches Helena by Tuesday, she said from the porch step. My attorney can file by Thursday at the earliest. That's fast enough, he said. The Wells situation won't move before Monday. Crane's waiting for your answer. He can wait a little longer than he planned. Something in her voice had shifted, still controlled, but with a quality underneath it, like pressure building behind a closed valve. When he realizes what you filed, Bram said, he'll move quickly. We need to be ready for that. I've been ready, she said, since September. He believed her. He posted the letter and rode home, and that should have been a reasonably settled afternoon, but it wasn't. Because when he came up his own lane, there were 2 men he didn't recognize sitting on horses in his yard, and Cord was standing between them and the house with the particular stillness of a man who has decided exactly what he will and will not allow. Bram came through the gate at a walk. He looked at the 2 men. Ranch hands by their gear, but hired hand gear rather than working gear, which was a distinction a man who'd spent enough years in cattle country learned to read. These were men between jobs or on a specific job. Help you, Bram said. The nearer one older, with a flat face and the eyes of someone who'd made a practice of not caring what he saw, tilted his head. Crane sends his regards, the man said, and his advice. He says a man in your situation bank coming due, cattle losses, neighbor trouble, might want to reconsider which side of a problem he stands on. Bram walked his horse to the hitching rail, dismounted, turned around. Tell Crane I've reconsidered, he said. Same answer. The man nodded like he'd expected this. He also says, just as a friendly observation, that a man raising a girl alone ought to think careful about the stability of his situation. Cord took 1 step forward. Bram put up a hand and Cord stopped. Bram walked to within 10 feet of the 2 riders and looked up at the flat-faced man with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that required his complete focus. Say that second part again, he said quietly. The man looked at him. Reading something in Bram's face, he recalibrated slightly. Just an observation. About stability. You go back to Crane, Bram said in the same quiet voice, and you tell him that if he uses my daughter as a point of pressure directly, indirectly, or in any form that a reasonable man could interpret as a threat against her, I will take everything I know to the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena. Every fence cut I witnessed, every hand I know he paid to quit, every supply operation I can document he pressured, the Alderman Spring, the boundary filing, Meridian Grazing Company. He paused. Tell him I said that name. Tell him I said it specifically. Watch his face when you say it." The two men exchanged a look. "You deliver that message exactly," Bram said, word for word. They rode out. Cord watched them go, then turned to Bram with an expression that combined respect and alarm in roughly equal measure. "Meridian Grazing Company," he said. "Should I know what that is?" "Not yet." Bram went to the porch and sat down on the steps, because his legs had decided they were done performing steadiness. "But Crane does. And now he knows I know." Cord was quiet for a moment. "That's going to make things move faster." "Yes," Bram said. "It is. It moved faster that same night." Bram woke at 2 in the morning to Tansy shaking his shoulder, and before he was fully awake he registered two things: the smell of cold coming through a window that should have been shut, and the sound from outside that wasn't wind. He was up and dressed in under a minute. Tansy was already at the window. "The north pasture," she said. She said it steadily, which cost her something he could see it cost her. "There are cattle moving." He looked. Through the dark he could make out movement shapes against the snow, too many shapes, moving in the wrong direction. North, toward the draw that connected his property to Crane's boundary line. "Get Cord," he said. "He's in the bunkhouse. Wake him." Quietly, he was pulling on his coat, his boots. "Then you go to the kitchen and you stay there. You bar the back door. You don't come outside. Understand? Papa Tansy." He looked at her directly. "I need you to do exactly what I said. I can't do what I need to do if I'm worried about where you are. Understood?" She looked at him with 8-year-old eyes full of something older. "Understood," she said. He went out into the dark. The temperature had dropped hard since sunset, the kind of cold that got inside your coat in the first minute and stayed there. The sky was clear and brutal with stars, the ground frozen to iron, and across the north pasture he could see why the cattle were moving. The fence was down. Not just weakened down, a section of it flattened. And through the gap the herd was drifting north with a particular passive momentum of cattle that had been pushed and didn't know they were being pushed. He heard Cord behind him and turned. Cord had his rifle. Bram had his own, taken from beside the door without thinking about it. "How many through?" Cord asked low. "Can't tell. 20, maybe more. They're moving toward Crane's line. In this dark he can claim they drifted natural." "I know." Bram looked at the break in the fence. The posts weren't just down, they'd been pulled. You could see the disturbed ground even in starlight. Someone was here tonight. Cord looked at the posts. Recently. Last hour. Ground's not settled. He looked north at the moving shapes of his cattle. "I have to go after them." "That takes you toward Crane's property in the dark." "Yes." Cord adjusted the rifle in his hands. "Then I'm going with you." They moved fast across the pasture, following the drift of cattle, staying low and quiet. The cattle were not panicked. They were moving with the disoriented purposefulness of animals that had been disturbed from set and were looking for somewhere to settle. In ordinary circumstances, Bram and Cord could have turned them with a shout and 2 horses. But there were no horses he'd come out without taking time to saddle, and every minute the herd moved further north. They were 200 yards past his fence line onto the open ground between his property and Crane's claimed boundary when Bram heard it. Horses. Multiple. Moving parallel to them from the east, not toward them but flanking, the way you flanked a herd you were steering. He stopped. Grabbed Cord's arm, they stood still. The sound continued, horses walking, deliberate, controlled. At least 3, maybe 4. "They're driving them," Cord said under his breath. "They've been driving them since the fence went down," Bram said. "We just didn't see it until now." In front of them, the cattle were moving into the entrance of the northern draw, a narrow cut in the terrain that ran northeast toward Crane's land. Once they were in the draw, in this dark, on frozen ground, you couldn't turn them without horses. Without horses, you couldn't get ahead of them. And without getting ahead of them, they would be on Crane's property before sunrise. He looked at the draw. He looked at the ridge above it, the same ridge he'd ridden 100 times, that he knew the way you knew the back of your own hand, every rock and fold in the place where the old stock trail cut back west along the upper face, the one that hadn't been used in 8 or 9 years, because it was rough going, and there was no reason to take it when the lower route was clear. There was a reason now. "Go back," he told Cord. "Get the horses. Saddle mine and yours and ride to Evangeline Wycliffe's property and tell Potts what's happening. Tell him to bring whoever he has and come in from the south. You understand? From the south, not the draw." "And you?" Cord said. "I'm going up the ridge. Bram, that trail is—" "I know what the trail is." He was already moving. "Go. Fast." He hit the ridge trail at the east end, Where it started barely visible now, overgrown at the edges, the footing unpredictable under frozen snow. He went up fast, faster than was smart, using the rocks and the brush for purchase, his boots finding the ledges by muscle memory rather than sight. Twice he went down on one knee. Once he caught himself on a root that held when he needed it to and let go immediately after, which was all he needed from it. At the top of the ridge he could see the draw below him, and in the draw his cattle, moving in a dark river, and flanking them on the east, 3 riders. He could see them clearly now from above, the horses' breath steaming in the cold air, the riders working the herd with the practiced ease of men who'd done this before. He looked west along the upper trail, 150 yards, maybe 200, to the point where the trail dropped back down to the valley floor on the far side of the draw ahead of the herd, ahead of the riders, the upper trail. He ran. He ran it in the dark on frozen ground, on a trail that hadn't been maintained since before Tansy was born, and he didn't think about any of that because thinking about it wouldn't help. He knew this ground. He'd walked every foot of this ridge in 14 years of working the land beneath it. His boots knew where the footing went soft and where it held. He ran, and he didn't fall, and 200 yards and 4 minutes later, he came down off the ridge onto the valley floor at the far end of the draw, ahead of everything. He had maybe 3 minutes. He found the gap in the draw wall, a natural break in the rock face, barely wide enough to work through, and got into it, and looked out. The cattle were coming. 50 feet. 40. He stepped out, raised both arms, and shouted. Not a word. Just sound the full-throated, carrying call that cattlemen used to turn a herd, the kind that hit the lead animal's instincts before their brains had time to process it. The led cattle balked. He moved toward them, arms wide, shouting again. The lead animals turned. Not all of them, not smoothly cattle turning in a draw were not a tidy thing. They pushed back against the cattle behind them, and the ones behind pushed forward, and for 30 seconds it was exactly the kind of churning confusion that could go wrong in a dozen ways. He held his position. He kept moving. He kept making noise. The lead animals committed to the turn. And then the whole front of the herd was moving back west, back toward the draw entrance, back toward his property. And the 3 riders who'd been driving from the east suddenly found the herd pushing toward them rather than away. He heard shouting, horses scrambling on frozen ground, a string of words that told him the riders had not planned for this. He kept driving the front of the herd, staying ahead, keeping them turned. And then he heard hooves from the south fast, purposeful, and through the draw entrance he saw Cord and Potts and Jenkins and Evangeline on horseback, coming in from the south exactly as he'd said, fanning out to receive the returning herd and push them the rest of the way home. He hadn't expected Evangeline. He saw her see him the moment of recognition across the churning dark of the draw, both of them working on opposite ends of the same problem, the cattle streaming between them. There was no time to say anything. He focused on the herd. They worked it for 40 minutes, turning, driving, sorting the confused cattle back through the gap in his fence and onto his land. Evangeline and Potts handled the east side with the efficiency of people who had been making decisions in the dark for weeks and were no longer surprised by hard conditions. Cord worked the west. Jenkins patched the broken section of fence with wire from the saddlebag temporary, rough, enough to hold a morning. When it was done, Bram counted. All of them. Every head he'd lost from the north pasture, back on his land. The 3 riders were gone. They'd pulled back when the herd turned, disappearing northward Cranes' property, and they'd taken nothing with them, because there was nothing to take. Everyone stood in the gap for a moment, breathing hard. Bram looked at Evangeline. She was on her horse, her coat covered in snow from somewhere in the last 40 minutes, a scratch along her jaw from a branch, or a rock he hadn't seen happen. You didn't have to come, he said. Cord said they were driving your cattle. She said it like that was the complete explanation. It is, he said. Then I had to come. She looked at the fence where Jenkins was wiring the brake. You ran the ridge trail. I needed to get ahead of them. She looked at the ridge, the dark shape of it against the star-filled sky, the upper trail invisible from below. In the dark, she said. Moonlight. Bram. She said it the way she'd said it in the study. There was no moonlight. It's a new moon. He didn't have a good answer for that. She looked at him for a moment, and whatever she was thinking didn't make it all the way to words. Is Tansy safe? She asked instead, in the kitchen. Barred door. Good. She straightened in the saddle. We should talk about what happened tonight and what we're going to do about it tomorrow. Not at 2 in the morning, come to my property after breakfast. All right. She turned her horse. Stopped. Cord said you named Meridian Grazing Company to Crane's men today, she said without turning around. I did. That's why they moved tonight instead of waiting. Yes. A pause. That was a calculated risk, she said. Most things are. She rode south without another word. Potts followed, then Jenkins. Cord came up beside Bram, and they stood looking at the repaired fence and the settled cattle and the ridge above them. That was something, Cord said. Don't, Bram said. I'm just saying I know what you're saying. Don't. Cord was quiet for a moment. She rode here at 2 in the morning in a new moon dark because Crane's men were taking your cattle. I noticed. Just making sure you noticed. They went inside. Tansy was in the kitchen, exactly where Bram had told her to be, wrapped in a quilt, sitting at the table with a book open in front of her that she hadn't been reading. She looked at him, checked him the way children checked, running her eyes over him for any sign of damage, and then settled. All of them? She asked. All of them. Mrs. Wycliffe helped. She helped. Tansy nodded and closed her book. Good, she said simply, and went back to bed. Bram sat at the kitchen table after she was gone, in the warm kitchen in the quiet house, with the sound of his cattle settled outside in the cold dark. He thought about Crane's men in the yard that afternoon, and the message he'd sent back. He thought about what Cord had said, that naming Meridian Grazing had moved the timeline. He'd known it would. That had been the point. Force the play before Crane was ready. Keep him off his chosen ground. But forcing a man like Crane off his chosen ground didn't stop him. It made him dangerous in a different way. Less controlled. More direct. Whatever came next was going to be bigger than fence lines and drifting cattle. Bram looked at the bank letter in the drawer. He looked at the deed with his grazing rights. He looked at the kitchen where Clara's curtains had gone from yellow to pale gold to something closer to cream in the years since she'd hung them. He thought about Evangeline riding in from the south at 2 in the morning because Cord had said Crane's men were taking his cattle. He didn't let himself think too long about what that meant. He put out the lamp and went to bed and lay there in the dark with the sound of the wind starting up again outside, and understood that the morning was going to require everything he had and that he wasn't going to face it alone. That thought was both useful and unsettling in ways he didn't have words for yet. He was at Evangeline's property by 7:30. He hadn't slept much after he'd gone back to bed an hour, maybe less, the kind of thin fractured sleep that left you more aware of having tried than actually rested. He'd been up before 5 again, checked the cattle twice, repaired the fence section properly with good posts, rather than the emergency wire Jenkins had run in the dark, and eaten something standing at the stove because sitting down felt like a decision he didn't have time for. Tansy had watched him over her breakfast with the steady attention of a child who had learned not to ask questions that wouldn't get answered. I'll be at Mrs. Wycliffe's, he told her. Cord's here. Don't go to school today. She looked up from her bowl. Why not? Because I said so. That's not a reason. Tansy. She looked at him. He looked back. She put her spoon down. All right, she said. He rode out. Evangeline was already at her desk when Potts let him in, the leather journal open in front of her and a new page of notes beside it, written in her careful hand. She'd slept. Or tried to. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. But she was dressed and focused, and there was coffee already made, which told him she'd been up long enough to think through at least some of what she wanted to say. She looked at the scratch along her jaw in passing. He'd noticed it again in daylight, longer than he'd thought last night, not serious but visible. Branch, she said, without him asking, coming down off the ridge path at the south end. I was moving fast. It needs cleaning. I cleaned it. She gestured at the chair across from her. Sit down. I want to show you what I've put together. He sat. She turned the journal so he could read it and walked him through what she'd added since 2 in the morning, the incident documented in full, with times, descriptions of the riders, as well as she'd been able to see them, the fence damage, the estimated number of cattle affected, and a detailed account of the prior afternoon's visit from Crane's men to Bram's property, which Jenkins had told her about on the ride home. Jenkins talks, Bram said. Jenkins was worried about you. She tapped the page. This is all evidence. Dated, witnessed, specific. The fence cutting in October that you saw and will testify to. The boundary filing we can contest. Last night's cattle driving. The intimidation visit to your property. She looked at him. And Meridian grazing. That's not evidence yet. It's a connection that needs to be argued. My attorney can argue it. She sat back. He wrote back faster than I expected. I had a reply waiting when I got home last night. He says the partnership connection between Crane and the Wycliffe sons, if it can be demonstrated to a territorial court, constitutes a material conflict of interest in the will contest. It doesn't automatically invalidate their claim, but it significantly damages their credibility as impartial heirs acting in good faith. Bram turned his coffee cup. What does he need? The original Meridian grazing filings. Trent's documentation. Your signed statement about what you witnessed in October. She paused. And he thinks we should consider going to the territorial marshal's office, directly, not waiting for the civil case. If last night constitutes criminal cattle theft, even attempted, that changes the nature of what we're dealing with. It does, Bram said. But to make that case, we need a witness who can place Crane's men at my fence line last night. Not just riders in the dark who I can't identify by name. Evangeline was quiet for a moment. I have something, she said. She opened the desk drawer and took out a small piece of metal, a spur rowel, the star-shaped wheel, broken off its axle. She set it on the desk between them. I found it this morning, she said. At the break in your fence line. Caught in the wire of the repair Jenkins did. Bram picked it up. It was distinctive, not standard issue, but custom work, the points filed to an unusual angle. He'd seen this before. Vickers, he said. Crane's foreman. He has spurs like this. I noticed them when he came to the school event in October. Custom-made a man at the Billings Ironworks does them for certain clients, files the rowels that specific way. He turned it in his hand. This puts Vickers at my fence line last night. Which puts Crane's operation at your fence line last night, Evangeline said. Directing the cattle theft. They looked at each other across the desk. This is enough to go to the marshal, Bram said. That's what I think. It's also enough to make Crane move very fast. He set the rowel down. When we file with the marshal, he'll know within a day. He has to assume we have more than we're showing, because that's what he'd do in our position. Then we need to move first. She said it without hesitation. Today, not this week. Today, he looked at her. She was watching him with the focused steadiness that he'd come to understand. Wasn't coldness, it was what she looked like when she'd worked through her fear and come out the other side of it into something useful. Helena is 2 days' ride, he said. The marshal has a deputy office in Billings. She'd already looked this up, he could tell by the way she said it, without checking anything. Deputy Marshal Cruz. I've met him once at the county land office. He's not Crane's man. You're sure? Crane's men in this county have a certain quality. Cruz doesn't have it. She stood. I can ride to Billings today. I'll take Potts. I'll go with you. You need to stay with your property. After last night, Cord can manage the property for 1 day. He stood. You're not riding to Billings alone with this much evidence, and Crane's men watching the road. That's not a discussion. She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between appreciation and the specific irritation of an independent woman being told something she already knew was correct. Fine, she said. We leave in an hour. I need to copy the relevant journal pages. I'm not carrying the original. I'll get my statement written out while you do that. They worked at opposite ends of her desk for 40 minutes, him with a pen and paper, writing out what he'd seen in October in the precise factual language of a man who understood that courts cared about specifics. Her at the copying, fast and accurate, not missing anything. Tansy arrived while they were finishing. Bram heard her horse in the yard and stood up, and by the time he reached the door she was already dismounting, with the efficient speed of a child who had decided something and wasn't interested in being argued out of it. I told you to stay at the ranch, he said. Cord's there. The cattle are fine. I brought your good coat. You left the other one here last time. She held it out, then looked past him at Evangeline in the doorway. Are you going somewhere? Billings, Evangeline said. Together? Bram said. Tansy processed this. That's good, she said, with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone whose opinion has been confirmed. She handed him the coat. I'll stay here with Potts. You'll go home with Cord? Cord is managing the property. You said so. I'll be more useful here. She looked at her father with Clara's eyes. Papa, I'm 8. I'm not going to get in the way. But I'd rather be here than sitting at home, not knowing what's happening. Bram looked at Evangeline. Evangeline looked at Tansy with the expression she sometimes got, the one that wasn't quite maternal, but was something neighboring it, something that had its own weight. She can stay, Evangeline said. Potts will be here. She won't be alone. Bram looked at his daughter for a long moment. You stay inside the house or the barn, he said. You don't ride anywhere. You don't go to the road. I know, Tansy said. If anyone comes who isn't Cord or Jenkins or someone you know from town. I find Potts and I stay close. I know, Papa. She met his eyes. I know. He put on the coat she'd brought him. They rode for Billings inside the hour. The road was hard, with frost and clear enough, the sky holding its flat white threat from yesterday without following through. Bram and Evangeline rode with Potts behind them, and they didn't talk much for the first stretch, the kind of comfortable working silence that had developed between them over weeks of shared problems and shared work. The silence of two people who didn't need to fill space with noise to feel the other person's presence. After about an hour, Evangeline said, I want to talk about what happens after. After the marshal's office? After all of it. If the marshal investigates. If the will contest gets complicated by the conflict of interest. If Crane loses the boundary filing, she kept her eyes on the road. Best case. And I know best case is not guaranteed, but best case. Where does that leave both of us? He thought about it honestly. It leaves Crane with a lot less influence in this valley. And it leaves two ranches that are both still standing, but still have the problems they had before Crane made things worse. Your bank deadline, she said. My bank deadline. And my need for experienced leadership on a property I'm still learning at a pace that would be fine if I had more time, and is not fine given how fast things are moving. He glanced at her. I've been thinking about a proposal, she said, and her voice was careful in the way it was careful when she was saying something she'd worked out thoroughly and was now committing to out loud. I want you to consider it fully before you respond, because your first instinct is going to be to say no. My first instinct, he said, is usually right. Your first instinct is usually proud, she said, which isn't the same thing, and I think you know that. He didn't have an immediate answer to that. Go ahead, he said. My property has capital and cattle and water and acreage. Yours has grazing rights on the South Ridge, the water access knowledge you demonstrated this winter, and skills that I would spend 10 years trying to hire, and probably not find. She said it straightforwardly, not as flattery. A formal partnership, not charity, not a loan, not me rescuing you from the bank, documented business arrangement, with contributions defined and profits divided according to what each party brings. Your debts get addressed through the partnership's first operating year. My property gets the management it needs. Both ranches operate under a cooperative structure that neither of us could sustain alone at this moment. Bram rode for a while, without saying anything. That's not a simple proposal, he said finally. No, it's a complicated one. That's why I want you to think about it properly. A pause. I'm not asking you to give anything up. You keep your deed. Your property stays yours. So does mine. What I'm proposing is a working arrangement between two ranches that happen to have complementary problems. He looked at the road ahead. You've thought about this for a while, he said. Since December, she said it without embarrassment. I wasn't going to say anything until the Crane situation was resolved one way or another. But you're riding to Billings with me today, and after today, things will move fast, and I'd rather have this conversation now than in the middle of whatever comes next. He turned it over. He thought about what it meant to say, yes, the pride of it, the difficulty of accepting that his situation required something different than going it alone. He thought about what it meant to say no, and what the bank letter in his kitchen drawer said about where a loan was going to get him by February. He thought about what Evangeline had said about his first instinct being proud rather than right. I'd need to see the proposal in writing, he said. Specific terms, what each party contributes, how decisions are made, how profits divide. She looked at him. He could see, from the corner of his eye, that she'd been prepared for refusal and was recalibrating to something else. I have a draft, she said. I can give it to you tonight when we're back. You have a draft. I said I've been thinking about it since December. He almost smiled. How detailed is the draft? Very. He wrote another minute. All right, he said. I'll read it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that's all I'm asking. Deputy Marshal Cruz operated out of a 2-room office above a surveyor's equipment supply on the main street in Billings, not impressive in terms of real estate. But the man himself was what mattered. He was 50-something, deliberate, with the look of someone who had spent a career in a territory where the distance between law and lawlessness was mostly a matter of paperwork, and whoever got there first. He listened to everything without interrupting. That, in Bram's experience, was the mark of someone worth talking to. Most people interrupted because they were already forming their response. Cruz listened like he was built as something, absorbing each piece and fitting it before reaching for the next. When they finished, he looked at the journal copies. He looked at Trent's documentation of the Meridian grazing filings. He looked at the rowel. "You're certain this belongs to Vickers," he said. "I've seen those spurs on him twice," Bram said. "The ironworks man in Billings who makes them can confirm the style he doesn't make many. It's specialty work." Cruz turned the rowel. "I know the ironworks. I know the man." He set it down. "This is enough to open an inquiry. It's not enough for immediate arrest. I want to be clear about that. An inquiry means I ride out. I ask questions. I look at Crane's property records and cross-reference them with the county survey on the boundary filing." "How long does that take?" Evangeline asked. "A week, maybe 10 days. He looked at her. "I know who you are, Mrs. Wycliffe. I know about the will contest. I'm going to tell you plainly that if what you've laid out here is accurate, and I'm not saying it isn't, then what Crane's doing crosses several lines, and the Meridian grazing connection to the will contest is something that the territorial court in Helena will take seriously." A pause. "But I can't move faster than the evidence justifies." Moving fast and moving wrong gives his attorney something to work with. "We understand," Evangeline said. "What I can do today," Cruz said, "is send a wire to Helena regarding the Meridian grazing matter and flag it for the territorial court's attention before your February date. That's within my authority, and it costs him something on the legal side while I build the criminal inquiry." "Do it," Bram said. Cruz looked at him. "You understand that once I open this inquiry, Crane will know. Men in his position have ways of knowing." "He already knows we're building a case," Bram said. "Last night proved that. He's not waiting anymore, he's moving. The inquiry won't change his tempo. It might change his options." Cruz studied him for a moment. "You've thought this through," he said. "We've had a long winter," Bram said. Cruz sent the wire before they left his office. The ride back was quieter. Not the working silence of the morning, but the different quiet of people who had done something they couldn't undo and were sitting with the weight of it. The afternoon had gone gray and cold, the flat white sky finally making good on some of its threats. A light snow starting as they came off the main road onto the valley route. Potts rode behind them. Bram and Evangeline rode side by side. "He'll know by tomorrow," she said. "Probably tonight. Then whatever he's going to do, he does it before the inquiry gets established." She looked at the road. "That's the window. A week, maybe less." "What does he do in a week when everything else has been cut off?" she said. It wasn't quite a question, it was the way she thought out loud, working through it. "He goes bigger," Bram said. "Men like Crane, when the small moves stop working, they don't scale back. They escalate. The blizzard last week. There'll be another one. The almanac has been wrong all winter about timing, but right about quantity." He looked at the clouds on the northwest ridge, the same direction he'd been watching since October, reading the season the way his father had taught him, and 14 years of Montana had confirmed. "There's a hard storm coming. Within the week, I'd say. He'll use it. He'll use it." She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking the particular quality of her attention when she was moving pieces into positions. "Then we use it first," she said. He looked at her. "If we know the storm's coming," she said, "and we know he'll move during it, we don't wait for him to move. We position ourselves before he does." She looked back at him. "Your herd and mine, combine movement to secure ground. If both herds are unconsolidated, defensible pasture when the storm hits, there's nothing to drive, nothing to steal, nothing to claim wandered. That's 2 days of coordinated work before the storm." "I know. We'd need more hands than we have between us." She nodded slowly. "There are 3 other ranches in this valley that Crane's taken cattle from. Not as systematically as us smaller operations, easier to dismiss individually. But they've lost animals." She turned to him. "If we brought them in, explained what we're doing and why, offered to include their herds in the consolidation." Bram looked at her. "You want to build a coalition," he said. "I want to survive a storm," she said. "The coalition is just what that requires." He thought about the Pruitt family. The Teller brothers, who ran a small operation on the East Creek. Old Harriet Voss, 70 years old and running 300 head on her late husband's land, with 2 hands and her youngest son. All of them had lost cattle this winter. None of them had been able to say why, publicly. "Harriet Voss," he said. "She's the one to talk to first. If she comes in, the others follow. She's been in this valley since before Crane bought the Fielding property. People trust her. Can you talk to her?" "I can talk to her tonight." Evangeline looked at him. "Tonight. Storm's coming." If I'm right about the timing, we have 4 days, maybe 5. He held her gaze. You talked to the Pruitts. I'll take Harriet Voss and the Teller brothers. She straightened in the saddle. All right, she said. They reached her property as the light was failing. Tansy was in the barn with Potts, as promised, brushing one of the horses with more attention than the horse strictly required. She looked up when they rode in, checked both of them, the same way she'd checked Bram the night before, running a quick accounting, and appeared satisfied. How'd it go? She asked. Well enough, Bram said. Is it over? Not yet. She nodded like she'd expected this. Mrs. Wycliffe, there's food on the stove. I made it. Both of them stopped. Evangeline looked at Tansy. You cooked? I followed the recipe in the book on the kitchen shelf. It's soup. It's probably fine. She went back to brushing the horse. You both look like you haven't eaten. Bram looked at Evangeline. Evangeline looked back at him with an expression that was for just a moment, before she got it under control, something close to undone by the ordinary simple fact of a child making soup in her kitchen. It's probably fine, Bram said. It smells fine, Potts said from the corner. The soup was in fact fine. Slightly oversalted, with the carrots cut to 3 different sizes because Tansy had given up on consistency halfway through, but hot and substantial, and exactly what 4 people who had ridden to Billings and back in January weather needed. They sat around Evangeline's kitchen table and ate it. And Tansy gave a detailed account of her afternoon, nothing dramatic. Potts had shown her how to check the water trough heating system. She'd reorganized the tack room hook order because the previous arrangement didn't make logical sense, and the kitchen was warm and full of the specific quality of noise that happened when more than 2 people occupied a space, and all of them were, at least for this hour, not in immediate crisis. After Tansy finished her soup, she looked at Bram with the focused seriousness that meant she'd been waiting to say something. Papa, she said, I heard you and Mrs. Wycliffe talking outside the barn. About the coalition. You weren't supposed to hear that. I wasn't trying to hear it. Sound carries when it's cold. She put her spoon down. Mrs. Voss will say yes. She told Johnny Pruitt's mother last month that someone needed to do something about the situation in this valley, and she was too old to do it alone. She looked at Bram steadily. She won't say no if you ask. Bram looked at his daughter. How do you know what Harriet Voss said to Johnny Pruitt's mother? Because I'm 8 and people forget I'm there. She picked up her spoon again. I told you that already. Evangeline made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the involuntary escape of one, before she stopped it. Bram looked at the table. After supper, he said, I'm riding to the Voss property. I'll come, Tansy said. You won't. Mrs. Voss likes me. She gave me apple cake at the harvest gathering. That's not a reason. Papa, she lost cattle too. She's angry about it. If you go alone, she'll listen because she respects you. But if I come, she'll talk, and talking is different from listening. Tansy said this with the calm certainty of someone describing a law of nature. People talk to me because I'm small and I'm not threatening. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Potts looked at his soup bowl. Evangeline looked at the window. Bram looked at his daughter and thought about all the reasons this was not a good idea, and then thought about Harriet Voss at the harvest gathering, and the way the old woman had pressed apple cake on Tansy and talked to her for 20 minutes while the adults milled around doing adult things, and how when Bram had come to collect Tansy, Harriet had looked at him over his daughter's head with an expression of specific approval. You stay next to me, he said. You don't ride ahead. You don't go inside without me. Tansy's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. Agreed, she said. Harriet Voss met them on her porch with a lantern and a rifle. She leaned against the doorframe, once she'd determined who was coming up her lane. She was a compact, weathered woman who moved with the economy of someone who had never wasted motion in 70 years and wasn't about to start. Calder, she said, and the girl. Mrs. Voss, Tansy said politely. Come inside. Cold enough to freeze the sense out of a person standing on a porch. They sat in her kitchen, which smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, and the particular accumulated warmth of a house that had been heated by the same stove for 30 years. Harriet put coffee in front of Bram and hot cider in front of Tansy, without asking what either of them wanted, and sat down and looked at Bram. Talk, she said. He talked. He laid it out in order what he knew, what Evangeline had documented, what they'd filed with the marshal's office today, what was coming with the storm, and what they needed to do before it arrived. Harriet listened the way Cruz had listened completely, building as she went. When he finished, she looked at her cider for a moment, then at Tansy, then back at him. The Wycliffe woman, she said. She's solid. She's the one who started documenting in October, Bram said. Before I even knew she was paying attention. Harriet made a sound. How many head has she lost? Confirmed, 11. Probably more from the south sections. I've lost 19, she said it flat, without drama. Thought it was the weather and bad luck, and my own poor management, for about 2 months, before I started thinking it was something else. She looked at the table. I'm 70 years old. I'm not going to get another chance at another ranch. The kitchen was quiet. I'm in, Harriet said. What do you need? I need you to talk to the Pruitts and the Teller brothers. Tonight if you can. She stood up. I can. She walked them back out to their horses and stood in the lamplight from her doorway, small and solid against the dark. Calder, she said as they mounted. Ma'am, that woman you're working with. She paused. She's not what Crane told people she was. No, Bram said. She's not. Harriet looked at him with the specific assessment of a 70-year-old woman who had watched men and women navigate hard country for half a century and knew what she was seeing. She didn't say anything else. She went inside. Riding home, Tansy was quiet for a long time, unusual enough that Bram glanced at her twice to check she was all right. She's lonely, Tansy said finally. Mrs. Voss? Yes. But she's not sad about it the way some people are. It's just there, she rode another 100 feet. Like you were before. He looked at the road ahead. Before what? He said, though he had a reasonable idea. Tansy didn't answer immediately. Before Mrs. Wycliffe came for tea, she said. He didn't say anything. The stars were very clear above the valley, the cold having burned away any suggestion of cloud. The snow that had started on the way back from Billings had stopped, and in the hard, bright stillness of the night, the valley looked the way it sometimes looked in winter, scraped, clean, honest, every line visible. Papa, Tansy said. Yeah, you're going to read that proposal she gives you. It wasn't a question. I said I would. I know you said you would. A pause. I mean, you're going to actually read it. He looked at his daughter. Yes, he said. I'm going to actually read it. She nodded, satisfied, and they rode the rest of the way home without talking. And the cold valley held them both. And somewhere to the northwest, the clouds that carried the next storm were already building over the mountains, moving toward Copper Ridge at the pace of something that had been coming all along and was simply taking its time arriving. The storm came on the third day. Bram had been watching the northwest ridge since before dawn, the way he'd been watching it all week. And when he stepped out at 5:40 in the morning and felt the particular quality of the air, not just cold but loaded, dense with something that hadn't released yet, he knew they had maybe 6 hours before it hit properly. He saddled up and rode to Evangeline's without eating breakfast. She was already outside when he arrived, standing in the yard with pots, both of them looking at the same ridge he'd been watching. Today, she said, when he came through the gate. This morning. 6 hours, maybe less. She looked at him. Are we ready? It was the right question, and the honest answer was, mostly. The previous 2 days had been the hardest sustained work he'd done since the first winter he'd spent on this land alone, when he'd been 30 years old and too stubborn to admit he'd bought a property that was trying to kill him. Harriet Voss had talked to the Pruitts and the Tellers the same night Bram had asked her to, and by the following morning all 4 neighboring operations had committed to the consolidation plan. What that meant in practice was 4 ranches worth of cattle moved onto the combined high pasture on the ridge's south face of Evangeline's land, primarily, which had the best protected ground, with Bram's South Ridge grazing rights opening additional acreage that doubled what she had alone. They'd moved cattle for 2 straight days with 7 people: Bram, Cord, Potts, Jenkins, Teller brothers, and young Pruitt, who was only 17 but worked like someone twice that age and asked good questions. Harriet Voss had supervised from horseback, which was both less useful physically and more useful in every other way, because Harriet watching the work had a clarifying effect on everyone doing it. Nobody cut corners when Harriet was watching. The herds were consolidated. The ground was as secure as they could make it. What they hadn't done was sleep much. We're ready enough, Bram said. How are the water troughs? Heating elements are running. I checked at 4 this morning. She looked at the ridge again. Crane hasn't moved. He will. I know he will. She turned to Potts. Get Jenkins and both horses saddled. I want someone riding the north perimeter every hour until the storm's too heavy. Already told him, Potts said, and went. She looked at Bram. Come inside. You haven't eaten. I'm fine. You rode here before breakfast. Come inside. He came inside. They ate standing up, both of them, which would have made Tansy comment about his habits if she'd been there. But Tansy was at Harriet Voss's property for the duration of the storm, which Harriet had suggested, and Bram had agreed to, with the relief of a man who had been worrying about that particular problem without saying so. Harriet had 2 hands who lived on her property, and a house built like something that intended to outlast everything around it. Tansy's would be safer there than anywhere. He'd told Tansy that morning when he dropped her off. Tansy had looked at him, then at the ridge, then back at him. "Come back," she'd said. "Not come back safe. Not be careful. Just come back." "I will," he'd said. She'd gone inside without looking back, which was either because she trusted him completely or because she didn't want him to see her face, and he suspected it was both. He was thinking about that when Evangeline said his name. He looked up from the plate he'd been staring at. "The proposal," she said. She was watching him carefully. "You read it last night." "And?" He set down his fork. He'd read it twice, actually once quickly, the way you read something you were bracing for, and once slowly, the way you read something you were trying to find a flaw in and couldn't. The terms were specific and fair in a way that told him she'd thought about it from both sides, including his side, including the places where his pride would catch on a word or a condition and need something different. She had anticipated those places and written around them. "The profit split in the first year," he said. 60-40 weighted toward my capital contribution, she said. "After the first year, it adjusts based on operational input. I want it to adjust quarterly, not annually. If I'm putting in more operational work than the proposal assumes, I don't want to wait 12 months for the terms to reflect that." She was quiet for a moment, considering. "Quarterly review with annual adjustment," she said. "That's reasonable. And the decision-making section. Joint decisions on all sales over a certain dollar threshold, but day-to-day management stays separate. Each of us manages our own property within the partnership structure. I'm not asking to run your operation, and I don't want you running mine. That's already in the proposal. It's in there vaguely. I want it specific." She looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. The expression of someone who had expected resistance and found instead that the resistance was actually engagement. "I'll make it specific," she said. "Then yes," he said. She went still. "Yes," he said again, "to the partnership. With those adjustments." She put her hand on the table flat, deliberate, like she was steadying herself on a surface she suddenly needed. "All right," she said. Her voice was even. Nothing in it performed. "We'll have it drawn up properly when this is over." "When this is over," he agreed. They might have said more, probably would have, but Jenkins appeared in the doorway with the tight expression that meant something was happening outside. "Riders on the North Line," he said. 6 of them. Coming from Crane's property. They were outside in under a minute. From the north fence line they could see the riders clearly, 6 men, spread in a line, moving at a deliberate pace across the open ground between Crane's property and Evangeline's. Not fast. Controlled. The pace of men who were confident about what they were doing and weren't in a hurry about it. Vickers was in the center. Even at distance, Bram recognized the set of the man's shoulders. "He's not hiding it," Potts said. "He doesn't think he needs to," Bram said. "What's the play?" Cord asked. He'd ridden over at first light, which Bram hadn't asked him to do and hadn't been surprised by. Bram looked at the riders. Then he looked at the ridge, the storm clouds sitting lower now, moving with visible purpose. Then he looked at Evangeline. She was already looking at him. "We don't engage," she said. "We document and we hold our ground. Every minute he's on this side of the fence line without provocation is another minute of evidence." "He's going to push the fence," Cord said. "Let him push the fence," Evangeline said. "We record who's there, what time, and what they do." Bram looked at her. "You brought paper." She held up the journal. They held the line for 40 minutes, while Crane's riders tested the north fence at 3 points, probing rather than breaking, looking for weaknesses that weren't there because they'd replaced every compromised post 3 weeks ago. Vickers rode along the fence line twice, looking at the consolidated herd on the high pasture with an expression Bram couldn't read at distance, but could imagine well enough. 6 riders against 4 hands and 2 ranch owners at a fence line was not a fight, but it was also not what Bram had expected. He kept watching Vickers. "He's stalling," he said quietly. Evangeline looked up from the journal. "What? 6 riders at a fence line. That's not an operation, that's a distraction." He turned around and looked south. Where would Crane go if he wanted to move cattle off our land? And he knew we were all watching the north. 3 seconds of silence. Then they both turned at the same moment and looked at the south draw. The same draw where Bram's cattle had been driven 3 weeks ago, on the opposite end of the combined pasture. Potts, Bram said. Already moving, Potts said, because Potts had been in cattle country for 40 years and had arrived at the same conclusion 2 seconds earlier. Bram and Cord and Potts rode south hard, leaving Jenkins and Evangeline at the north fence. The south draw was a 20-minute ride in good conditions. In the wind that was now picking up ahead of the storm's front edge, leaning into the horses, with the temperature dropping as they rode, it was 25. They came over the south ridge in time to see 4 riders below, working a section of fence that connected the combined pasture's lower edge, working it fast, with the urgent efficiency of people on a shortened timeline. The fence was already down in one section, and through the gap, 30 or 40 head of cattle were moving south. Cord pulled his rifle. No, Bram said, not yet. Bram witnesses first. He looked at the riders below. He recognized one of them, a man called Dawes, who'd worked several ranches in the county over the years, the kind of itinerant hand who went where the money was. Dawes, he called out, loud enough to carry, Calvin Dawes. I see you. The riders below froze. Bram kept his voice carrying and clear. Cord Rayleigh's here, Elias Potts, Bramwell Calder. We all see you. And Calvin Deputy Marshal Cruz knows your name. He's been asking about you specifically since Tuesday. That last part was a stretch. Cruz knew the names of several men associated with Crane's operation, Dawes among them, but asking specifically was Bram's editorial addition. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Dawes heard his own name said out loud in that situation, and what a man did when he heard his name said out loud in that situation told you everything. Dawes turned to his horse. He rode north. The other 3 hesitated, looked at each other, and followed. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't clean. The cattle that had already moved through the gap were still moving, and the fence was still down. And getting those animals back was going to take the rest of the morning. But the 4 riders were gone, and whatever Crane had planned for that cattle had not happened, and every one of those animals had an ear tag that matched Evangeline's or Harriet Avos's or the teller's documented records. Potts was already off his horse, working the gap. Cord went after the cattle. Bram stood at the ridge line for a moment, looking north toward where Vickers and his 5 men were, still, presumably, sitting at the north fence, performing a distraction that had just run out of purpose. He thought about Crane in his house 3 miles away, waiting for word that the South Draw operation had succeeded. He thought about what it was going to feel like to not get that word. He pulled out the small notebook he'd started carrying 2 weeks ago, his own version of Evangeline's journal, less detailed but consistent, and wrote down everything he'd just seen. Names, times, what happened, in what order. He wrote it before the details could soften at the edges, the way details did when you waited. Then he went to help Cord with the cattle. Deputy Marshal Cruz arrived 2 days after the storm broke. He came with 2 men from his office and a territorial court document that had Crane's name on it, not an arrest warrant yet, but a formal notice of inquiry with enough specific allegations attached that it had the weight of a thing that was moving toward something definite and unstoppable. He also brought, somewhat unexpectedly, a copy of a wire from Helena from the territorial court indicating that the will contest filed by the Wycliffe sons had flagged for conflict of interest review based on the Meridian grazing documentation. Cruz sat at Evangeline's kitchen table, the same table where Bram had eaten standing up and agreed to a partnership, and read a letter from a bank that was no longer the most pressing thing in his life, and went through everything they'd documented. He took the journal. He took Bram's notebook. He took signed statements from Potts, Cord, Jenkins, both Teller brothers, and Ed Pruitt's son, who had been riding the South Road during the night of the fence incident and had seen things he hadn't known were important until Bram asked him. He took the spur rowel, which had been in Evangeline's desk drawer since the morning she'd found it. Vickers, Cruz said, holding the rowel. Crane's foreman, Bram said. I talked to the ironworks man yesterday. Cruz turned it. He confirmed the style and said he'd made 3 sets of spurs with that particular rowel modification. 1 set for Vickers. He has the order records. He set it down. That's a direct physical connection between Crane's operation and your fence line on the night of the cattle driving incident. Evangeline said nothing. She was watching Cruz with the focused patience of someone who had been building toward this moment for months. The formal inquiry moves to Helena next week, Cruz said. Given the documentation you've provided and the physical evidence, I expect the territorial attorney to recommend charges within 30 days. Cattle theft at this scale, coordinated over this period, with the financial motive connected to the Meridian grazing scheme that's not a fine and a warning. That's a case that ends careers. He looked at both of them, and likely properties. A man facing those charges and those fines tends to find that holding a large cattle operation becomes difficult. Bram thought about the Alderman Spring, about the water underneath this valley that Crane had been positioning himself to control for years. The smaller ranchers, he said. The cattle Crane's men took from Harriet Voss, the tellers. Pruitt is their recovery. Documented losses against a proven theft operation can be civilly claimed, Cruz said. It's slow. But yes, there's a process, he paused. Mrs. Wycliffe, your situation with the estate is separate from the criminal inquiry. But the court in Helena will receive all of this documentation. The conflict of interest in the will contest is significant. I wouldn't make predictions about outcomes, but I'd say the foundation of their case has developed some serious problems. Evangeline looked at the table for a moment. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than anything else she'd said in months. Cruz left with everything they'd given him, and the two men from his office, and the weight of what they'd built, shifted not gone, not resolved, but moving now in the direction of something that had an endpoint. Crane came himself 3 days later, no riders, just Crane alone on his expensive horse up Bram's lane in the gray morning light. Bram saw him coming and stayed on the porch and waited, and did not go down the steps. Crane looked different. Not broken men like Crane didn't break easily, and sometimes didn't break at all but diminished in some specific way, the way a structure looked when something load-bearing had given way internally. Still standing, visibly less certain of that fact. Calder, he said, Crane. He didn't dismount. That told Bram something a man who dismounts is making a decision to stay for a conversation. Crane was keeping his options mobile. I want to know what it'll take, he said. To stop this, Bram looked at him. Nothing, he said. It's already moving. You'd have to talk to the territorial attorney about stopping it, and I don't think he'll be interested. Crane's jaw worked. I have resources, I know you do. I have attorneys who I'm sure you do. Bram looked at him steadily. You should use them. You're going to need them. He came down one step, just one, not to close the distance, but to make a point about where he was and wasn't going. But if you're here thinking there's something you can offer that makes what you've done go away, there isn't. The documentation's with Cruz. The Meridian grazing connection is in Helena. The spur roll is evidence. That's not a negotiation. That's just what it is. Crane looked at him for a long moment. Something crossed his face, not remorse. Nothing that gentle. More like the recognition of a calculation that had come out wrong. Run 3 times and come out wrong each time. And there was no 4th calculation to run. The Wycliffe woman, he said. Mrs. Wycliffe, Bram said, is not part of any conversation I'm willing to have with you. Crane pulled his reins. You've made an enemy, he said. You were always my enemy, Bram said. I was just the last one to admit it. Crane rode out. Bram watched him go the full length of the lane, the full distance to the road, until the sound of hooves on frozen ground faded completely. Then he went inside and put the kettle on, because his hands were cold, and the morning was still early, and there was work to do. The territorial court's formal review of the Meridian grazing connection took 6 weeks. Bram knew this because Evangeline told him, in the careful, specific way she communicated legal developments, writing over or sending pots with a note when something moved. The will contest was suspended pending conflict of interest review, which wasn't a resolution, but was the contest standing still, which meant Evangeline's position on her property remained uncontested in practice, while the lawyers argued about whether the contest should continue at all. In February, 1 week before Bram's bank deadline, Evangeline's attorney in Helena secured an emergency injunction tying the estate dispute to the fraud inquiry. The injunction effectively froze any claims on the property while the inquiry was active. The bank, advised by their own Helena contacts that the property situation was under active territorial court review, extended Bram's deadline by 90 days pending resolution. 90 days wasn't forever, but the partnership was already in motion. They'd had it drawn up by a lawyer in Billings in late January specific, adjusted to the terms Bram had asked for, with quarterly reviews and separate management structures, and a profit split that both of them had looked at and found fair. It wasn't a perfect document. No document written by people was perfect. But it was honest, and it covered what it needed to cover. And when Bram had signed it, he'd felt something he hadn't expected, not relief, not pride, but something quieter than either. the feeling of a decision that fit the shape of what was actually true, rather than the shape of what he'd always told himself he needed to be. Spring came late, the way it always did in Montana, not all at once, not generously, but in increments that felt earned. The consolidated herd wintered well. Better than well, given the conditions the high pasture had held, the water systems had run, and the losses across all 4 participating ranches were lower than any of them had managed alone in a difficult year. Harriet Voss, who had not been given to paying compliments in her 70 years, told Bram at the March cooperative meeting that the consolidation had saved her 14 head she'd have lost otherwise. "That's a significant number for my operation," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "You and the Wycliffe woman should be proud of it. It was more than just us. I know that." She looked at him with the specific assessment he'd learned to recognize as her version of warmth. That's rather the point. The cooperative meetings had started in February informal, at rotating properties, whoever could make it. By March, it was all 4 ranches attending, and by April Ed Marsh had started coming because he had freight interests that connected to all of them, and the school teacher had asked if she could sit in because 2 of the issues discussed road access, the water table, the county's position on the boundary dispute had direct effects on the school. It was not a grand organization. It was 4 ranches and a freight operator and a school teacher sitting in someone's kitchen talking about shared problems. But it was a thing that hadn't existed before, and its existence changed the texture of how Copper Ridge operated, in the way that small, persistent things sometimes change textures without anyone deciding formally to change them. Crane's inquiry moved slowly, the way criminal inquiries moved in a territory where the wheels of official process were large and not well oiled. But it moved. By April, Vickers had been identified by name in the formal charges. By May, 2 of Crane's hired men had given statements, the particular kind of statements that hired men gave when they understood the alternative was absorbing consequences meant for someone with more resources to weather them. The Wycliffe sons withdrew the will contest in June. Evangeline told Bram on a Tuesday morning in early summer, riding over without announcement, which was how she often arrived now, not because she'd stopped respecting boundaries, but because the boundaries between their operations had become permeable enough that riding over was a normal part of the day. She found him in the south pasture, checking the fence line still, always, checking the fence line, and rode up and said it simply. "It's done." They withdrew. He turned from the fence. "Both of them?" "Both of them. The attorney sent word this morning." With the fraud inquiry and the conflict of interest ruling, continuing cost more than it was worth, and the outcome was no longer favorable. She said it evenly, the way she said most things. "So the estate is yours," he said. "It was always mine." A pause. "Now it's just paperwork that says so." He looked at her on her horse, in the early summer light straighter in the saddle than she'd been in September, certain where she'd been careful before. The kind of change that came from a winter of doing hard things and finding out you were still standing at the end of them. "Congratulations," he said. It felt inadequate. "Thank you." She looked at the fence line, then back at him. "Are you free this evening? The quarterly review is due, and I want to go through the numbers before the Teller brothers come Thursday." "I'm free." "Come to supper then." She rode back. He watched her go, and then turned back to the fence, and stood there for a moment doing nothing, just standing in the summer grass with the mountains above him and the cattle behind him, and the sound of the valley and the found doing what valleys did when the season had turned, and the worst of. Winter was far enough away to stop defining everything. He thought about what it had cost to get here. Not in money, though there was that, the debt restructuring, the lean months, the partnership terms that had required him to admit, in writing, that he needed something he couldn't build alone. Not in pride, though there was that too. The kind of pride that it had made him watch the Hendersons lose their land without saying a word, because it wasn't his business, and he'd convinced himself that staying out of things was the same as being clean. He'd spent a long time confusing those two things. There was something he'd understood, slowly, through that winter, not in a single moment, but accumulated, the way understanding usually came. Through enough small moments that eventually you looked up and found you'd arrived somewhere without choosing a specific day to arrive. The understanding was this, that the thing he'd called independence, the refusal of help, the insistence on managing alone, the pride of not asking had not been strength. It had been a way of making sure nothing could be taken from him by making sure nothing was shared. You couldn't lose what you'd never allowed close. but you also couldn't build it. And at some point, whatever you'd protected so carefully became just a smaller and smaller thing, fenced in by its own isolation. Evangeline had understood something he hadn't, or had understood it faster, that what she needed wasn't protection from the world's interference, but partners within it. People who had skin in the same problems, and could be trusted because their interests ran parallel, not because they were charmed or obligated. He'd been that person for her before he'd admitted it to himself. She'd been the same for him, in a way he was still working out the full shape of. The harvest gathering in September was the first one Bram had attended in 4 years, with something other than the dull, low-grade dread of a man who knows the people around him are measuring the distance between where he is and where he's going to fall. He came with Tansy, who wore her coat buttoned correctly for the first time in recent memory, and then unbuttoned it again halfway through because it was warm. Harriet Voss was there, talking to the schoolteacher, with the focused attention of a woman deciding whether to trust someone. The Teller brothers were there, looking more relaxed than they'd looked in years. Ed Marsh was there, working through a plate of food with the efficiency of a man who ate at events primarily to avoid the appearance of not eating at events. Evangeline was there, talking to Ed Pruitt near the supply table, and Bram watched her from across the yard for a moment before she saw him watched her laugh at something. Pruitt said, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that didn't calculate how it looked, and thought about the woman who had sat on the schoolhouse steps in September, in a new county with no one talking to her. Tansy had talked to her. He thought about that, sometimes the specific fact of it, the chain of consequence that ran from an 8-year-old sitting down next to a stranger on a cold step because the stranger looked like she needed company. Not because Tansy had calculated an outcome. Not because she'd understood the full picture. Because she'd seen something simple and responded to it simply, the way children sometimes did before they learned all the reasons not to. He hadn't given his daughter nearly enough credit for that. Later in the evening, Tansy found him standing near the corral fence alone, which she apparently found unacceptable, because she walked directly toward him with the purpose she brought to most things, and took him by the hand and led him toward where Evangeline was now standing at the edge of the gathering, preparing to ride home. He knew what she was doing before she did it. Tansy, he said. She ignored him. She walked up to Evangeline and took her hand exactly the way she'd taken it a year ago, outside the schoolhouse, in the same matter-of-fact claim of connection, and stood between them holding both their hands. You're always going home, she said to Evangeline, and Papa's always watching you go. She looked between them. There's a room at the ranch. The yard around them had the quality of a yard full of people who are paying elaborate attention to other things. Evangeline looked at Tansy for a long moment. Something crossed her face, not embarrassment, not quite something more fundamental than that. The expression of a person being seen clearly by someone who doesn't have a reason to be anything but honest. That, Evangeline said carefully, is a decision for the adults. You're both adults, Tansy said. Yes, Evangeline said. We are. She looked at Bram. He looked back. There was a moment, just a moment, where everything that had accumulated over a year of hard winters and repaired fences and 2-in-the-morning rides and kitchen tables and signed documents and the specific quality of silence between two people who had learned each other's habits without discussing it, sat in the air between them like weather about to break. Tansy, Bram said. Go find Mrs. Voss. Tansy considered whether this was worth arguing about. Fine, she said, and dropped both their hands, and walked away with the slight injured dignity of someone who has done excellent work and not received adequate recognition. Bram and Evangeline stood near the corral fence. She's not wrong, Evangeline said. She's rarely wrong, he said. It's one of her less convenient qualities. She looked at him with the expression that was related to a smile, but lived slightly to the left of one. Bram Calder, she said. It was the first time she'd used his full name, and the way she said it, not formal, not teasing, just precise, did something to the air. Evangeline Wycliffe, he said. Ask properly, she said. When you're ready. And I'll answer honestly. When I'm ready, he said. Yes. He was ready before the gathering ended. He asked her on the walk to the corral, quietly, without ceremony, in the plain language of a man who had spent enough of his life trying to make things sound better than they were and had decided, sometime in the last 12 months, that plain was worth more than polished. He told her what he thought and what he wanted, and what he couldn't promise and what he believed he could. She answered honestly as she'd said she would. The answer was yes. They married at the Calder Ranch in November, in the kitchen, because the kitchen was where everything important in that house had happened, and it seemed right to keep the pattern. Harriet Voss came. Cord came and Potts and Jenkins. Ed Marsh came and ate a great deal. The Teller brothers came and stood near the back with the slightly overwhelmed expressions of men who had not attended many weddings. Tansy stood next to Bram and held his hand during the ceremony, and afterward stood next to Evangeline and then stood between them, and seemed to decide that was the position she'd been working toward all along. Evangeline kept her property. Bram kept his. The partnership agreement, reviewed quarterly, ran both operations with a precision that neither had managed alone, and in its second year turned a profit that paid the last of Bram's bank debt and funded 2 new hires and a water system expansion that benefited both ranches and, through the cooperative structure, created pressure on the county to address the broader valley water access that Crane had been quietly monopolizing for years. Crane's case worked through the territorial system slowly, the way those things did. He didn't go to prison men, with his resources rarely did, in 1,889 or any other year. But the fines were substantial, and 2 of his holding companies were dissolved under court order, and the land he'd accumulated through pressure and fraud was subject to claims that consumed years of legal fees, and came out, in most cases, against him. He sold the fielding operation, the core of his valley empire, within 3 years. He left Copper Ridge and did not come back. The Alderman Spring stayed on Evangeline's property. In a dry year, 4 years later, when the valley's water situation became exactly as serious as the GLG had always suggested it would, it was Evangeline who convened the meeting at the cooperative, which by then had 7 ranches and the town's freight association, and a county representative attending about how the spring's output could be shared equitably rather than controlled exclusively. That meeting was the first time anyone in Copper Ridge discussed valley water as a shared resource rather than a private asset. It wasn't the last. The ranch that had seemed destined to disappear, the one Bram had worked alone for 14 years, that the bank had measured and found wanting, that Rutherford Crane had identified as a small problem easily solved, became, in the years after the partnership, something harder to categorize than a successful business. It became a place that people came to with problems and left with something useful, because the 2 people running it had been through enough of their own problems to know that useful was worth more than impressive. Tansy grew up in that place. She grew up watching 2 people manage disagreements with the specific bluntness of partners who respected each other enough not to perform agreement. She grew up watching her father learn, slowly and with difficulty and occasional loud frustration, that asking for something wasn't the same as surrendering it. She grew up watching Evangeline, who had come to Montana alone, and frightened in ways she'd never shown anyone build a life that belonged entirely to herself, including the part of it she chose to share. These were not lessons anyone taught her deliberately. They were just what was visible if you were the kind of child who paid attention. Tansy was that kind of child. She remained that kind of person. Years later, when she was grown and running her own operation, and someone asked her where she'd learned to handle difficult situations, with the combination of patience and absolute refusal to be moved that she was known for, she thought about it genuinely. She thought about a woman sitting alone on a schoolhouse step. She thought about sitting down next to her. I learned early, she said, that the loneliest people and the strongest people are often the same person, and that sometimes what they need isn't rescuing. She paused. Sometimes they just need someone to sit down beside them and stay. That was all. That was, in the end, everything.